Joe Stevens, the middle-ranking manager, wakes up in a weird triangular well that's got concrete walls on it. Since there are no bridges or monuments nearby, he understands that this is not St. Petersburg at all. Of all the attractions in the middle, only stone millstones in a circular trench. Joe knocks on an iron door nearby with the question of clearing the riddle of the location, but is silent from there. Suddenly, the voices of colleagues from nearby concrete wells, who politely ask you to shut your mouth. There's only one poor guy in the neighborhood with a vent grate who could explain that Joe was drugged before he got here. And now he has to make some hard money. When he leaves to work, Joe tries to bury the Prince of Persia and sprinkle his way out. Either the size has increased, or the gap is not in time jammed, but nothing works. Suddenly, a dry ration with a bottle of water seeps into the crack in the door. Joe runs to the door and begs the guard to let him out. He is the manager, not the worker, and should not be here. But the law enforcement officer is relentless, and he hits the wrong hand with a stick. After rewinding the damaged limb with a tie, Joe is forced to wait for further developments, accompanied by a dry ration. At 11:30 evening the projection of the company, Malort, is included. It is Duck. A female voice reported that he was participating in a training program designed to improve his performance as an employee. The projection goes off without answering Joe's questions. But the neighbor on the other side of the wall explains that here, ordinary workers work for the good of the corporation, improving its performance. Nobody here uses names, and at midnight the most inefficient employee is fired. What does that mean? Joe doesn't know. But when the time comes, he hears the screams of pain. The woman's voice explains that the dismissal took place. In the morning, the neighbor explains that in this way the company motivates subordinates to try harder, rather than kick the crap for a guaranteed salary. When the next distribution begins, the guard from behind the door warns that the cell should always be clean. The neighbor advises to throw the garbage and waste into special holes in the corner of the triangular well. When Joe does, he notices a strand of hair sticking out in the ground that leads him to a buried skull. The neighbor explains that these are previous employees who failed to cope with the load. He explains that every employee who joins Malord, the world's leading company, signs a bunch of documents. Thanks to these papers, the company can do with them whatever it wants, including such training. 5 minutes before the start of the working day, the projection tells Joe that his productivity in the company has fallen. Together with it, the efficiency of the department, through that branch and as a result of the whole company. So it is now engaged in motivation. To start in a working day, he needs to score 50 points. Otherwise, there is a penalty. For the full rotation of the stone disc is awarded 1 point. At midnight, an employee with a minimum score is fired. After a beep to start work, Joe rolls up his sleeves and gets to work, pushing the Jordans around his own axis. That's how the day goes. He's pushing, and the projection on the wall is playing a commercial about what a great company Mellard is. At 10:00 p.m., when work is done, Joe scores 100 points, double the normal. He goes to bed, trying to ignore the midnight screams of the fired woman. In the morning, the manager discusses with the neighbor the daily rate of points. He warns that it is not necessary to tell how much he twisted in a day, because then the opponent enough to gain 1 point more. Joe then tells about his pregnant wife. They're waiting for their first child. Finally, the neighbor warns that if Joe tries hard, the company will not reward him, but just raise his daily allowance. All for the good of the company. Starting another shift, Joe recalls how he and his wife were looking for a new big house. For such thoughts, he has already scored 150 points, receiving meager praise from Mallard's projection. Later, however, the guard's command is heard to approach the door and remove all clothes. Afraid that he has the least number, Joe obeys. When the door opens, he goes out into a dark corridor, where he is thrown with water from a water cannon and thrown on the floor of soap. A bath day at his favorite job. In the morning, he and his neighbor discuss the meaning of what is happening. He says that he does not know him. After all, their work is senseless, as they produce nothing and produce nothing. Just roll the stone around like corporate Sisyphus. When Joe runs out of bottled water during the day, he asks Mallard for more, but the neighbor says the company only allocates the minimum required. The goal of the event is to reveal the horizons of the staff, to find out how far they are willing to go. The interviewer suggests that Joe filter the urine through the insole of the shoe in the blind area of the camera, but Joe refuses. He is not Kevin Costner, but a distant world. While still working, the manager remembers his pregnant wife. She wanted to go to work despite a doctor's injunction so she could pay the bills. Joe said he was going to be promoted soon, but in fact, the prospect has loomed before him for years, but without results. Immersed in thought, he scores 370 points per day. Falling powerless on the floor, he sees a scratched name on the bottom of a wooden handle. Alex. According to a neighbor, this is a local legend. A man who managed to get out of here alive. Joe wonders why this place wasn't shut down. Didn't Alex tell anyone about the corporate bullying? In the morning, Mallard gives Joe a record-breaking achievement award, a pen with a name engraving. He sarcastically snaps at the interlocutor. Immediately after that, the daily allowance increases from 50 points to 370. The voice says that, striving for better results, Joe himself becomes better. There's nothing to do. Joe starts spinning millstones. But after the first round, the point is not credited. The neighbor explains that he was fined. Now the score is given in 2 rounds. A madman from innovation takes the job. But in the evening he realizes that he does not have time. Joe talks to his neighbor about it, and he goes on about it like he shouldn't have busted his ass for records, or it's gonna come back on everybody. For example, they'll raise the overall minimum to Stahan's rate. In the evening, the projection tells Joe that he did not handle the normal and framed colleagues. Perhaps to motivate him better, the company should attract his pregnant wife Kate. Then he will work better. Excited, Joe swears he'll do it anyway, as long as the corporation doesn't hurt his wife. A woman's voice gives him a second chance but complicates the task. At the top of the wall, an annoying red lamp is turned on as a reminder. After wrapping the handle with his jacket, he begins to work, dreaming that he would be next to a vacation friend. The man with John Cena's complexion is easier to roll weights. At some point, he starts hallucinating. Joe sees himself in a suit. Glitch mocks him, reminding him that he is only a cog in a huge corporate mechanism that is easily replaced. Fake Joe calls to surrender, but remembering his wife and future son, the manager takes a second breath. At the last second, he gains the final score. The projection praises him, canceling the previous penalty. In the morning, as an encouragement, Joe shows a video of his wife from the hospital. She successfully gave birth while he was working here for thank you. But the man is in a different mood. He asks his neighbor about Alex, who successfully gets out of here, and he advises him to look at the wall in the blind area. There, Joe notices a crack, a mark from a sealed hole. After finding the pen given earlier, the manager uses it to unlock the putty. Work goes slow, only in rare hours of rest. The daily norm on the senseless rental of the wheel around the axis no one cancelled. But a few days later he breaks a hole and finds a ventilation tunnel. After consulting with a neighbor, Joe crawls along it away. He's out in the dark, probably where the nightmare used to go. After stumbling across the handle of a similar journey, Joe realizes that he is in a nearby cell. Then a bright light to the eyes that blinds him for a moment. He is then beaten with a truncheon by a guard. Joe wakes up in his cell. The hole is closed again, and Mellard raises the standard for all workers to 1,000 points as punishment for the selfishness of an individual employee. In addition, the guard breaks the leg of his neighbor companion, so that he cannot even once bypass. The neighbor admits that he is partly responsible for the system. As an IT man, Mellard created an artificial intelligence perplexed by ever-increasing efficiency. As a result, the system has developed its own staff motivation methodology, constantly raising the standard and demanding the impossible for maximum impact. Realizing that he is only dealing with a machine algorithm, Joe suggests confusing him. If none of the employees are employed, it will be impossible to identify the worker with fewer points to dismiss. Joe and the neighbor shout their idea to the others and encourage them to strike, just like film writers and actors, because of which one person is forced to take the fall. They agree. That's how it goes all day. If we don't do anything, we'll watch the mandatory ads from Mellard. But a few minutes before the end of the day, the projection clarifies that the system is protected from fools. All employees with 0 points will be fired. The disappointed workers start to turn the wheels. The neighbor convinces Joe to follow their example, otherwise he will die. He can't even get up because of the fracture. With tears in his eyes, the manager obediently makes a turn, gaining a minimum score. Between the end of work and midnight, Joe talks to a neighbor. He admits that he is Alex. His escape failed, but he hoped Joe would have better luck. When midnight comes, a neighbor is guarded and Joe closes his ears with his hands to avoid hearing his screams. In the morning, Mellard reminds Joe that he must obey, not rebel, and strive for efficiency rather than individualism. As a motivational video, he is shown a video of his wife with a child who is already learning to walk. Not believing that it has been so long and that he has not seen his son, Joe breaks down. He kicks the walls despite the warning projection. For damage to the property of the company, he is ordered immediate dismissal. The cell door opens and 12 employees with tablets walk out. They line up neatly along the walls, without saying a word, just stand and stare silently. Joe asks them what's going on, but they don't even react when he yells. Next comes a guard with a tray, with syringes and capsules. While wearing gloves and filling a syringe, he tells Joe that he loves his job, especially the firing process. And soon the guard will be promoted as a valued employee. Then he will move to a new place, perhaps to Joe's new house, where a single mother now lives. The reminder of his wife and son makes Joe furious. He rushes at the guard and beats him, turning his face into a natural mush with a lump of snot and whipped complacency. In the process of the projection, Milord notices that the guard failed his task, and as an incompetent employee will be immediately fired. So to speak, came desirable, left the lecherous. Cunning artificial intelligence suggests Joe pursue a process of dismissal instead of revoking his own resignation and promotion. However, the manager suddenly stops looking at his bloody fists and what he was doing. Not wanting to fall into the category of an unquestioning slave, Joe gets up from the battered guard and screams that he will not obey, and he quits altogether. The frame changes. Joe in a suit is sitting at a table with sensors connected to his head in a room full of employees. His eyes are opening, and he doesn't know where he is. He is approached by his handler, a man with a guard's face, and says that Joe has successfully completed a training program and deserves a promotion. He clarifies that the program has a side effect. It took you a while to realize that it wasn't a few months, it was an hour, and all he was doing was artificial simulation. Almost like the Matrix, just not as cool. Curator praises Joe for the results shown and invites him to a new office, several floors up. While the manager quietly comes to, the interlocutor is constantly praising the company, where there is always a lot to grow in terms of career. After bringing Joe to the new office, the curator reveals that the way things work and leaves. Closing the door behind him, Joe sits at the table, takes out his phone and calls his wife. For the first time in 10 years, he calls from work in the afternoon. He listens to her voice and sends his regards to the unborn child, while also experiencing flashbacks to retraining programs. Tears are drawn over his eyes. After the conversation, Joe carefully inspects the workplace, preparing to start work. In a triangular office just like this, but smaller, with hours on the wall and ventilation, he has to do a monotonous job that no one needs to do to have something to eat in rare hours of rest. The only difference from the simulation is now he's doing it supposedly voluntarily. But remembering how he dreamed of seeing his son instead of burning at work, Joe looks at the camera and says he will destroy this corporation. The film ends on this naive false note.